Okay, so good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us. We're here in Sefer Shofetim, the book of Judges, chapter 2. And we're going to point out some of the maddening aspects of chapter 2, right? Laurie already said it's a frustrating chapter and a frustrating book, no question. We're going to go through all of the Pesukim in chapter 2 because they're all very important and all very relevant. And we're going to touch on a number of important details and a number of important points. Overall, I want to focus on three major issues. We will mention some other details here and there, but to me, I think there's three major points. Number one is going to be, why is Avodah Zarah so enticing to the Jewish people? The concept of Avodah Zarah is going to be the major sin that will repeat itself over and over again. And for the modern day ear, the concept of idolatry and some of the things that the Jewish people are worshiping is very hard to grasp, like bowing down to trees, honoring idols. It just doesn't compute. It just doesn't make sense. And so we have to answer the question, what is it about idolatry that is so enticing to the Jewish people that they just can't get out of it? And I think what we'll find in that answer is something that actually could relate very much so to our own worship of Hashem. And it might be a little bit scary that we might be bordering on certain concepts of idolatry without actually even knowing it. That's one issue that I'd like to discuss. Issue number two is we want to focus a little bit on that cycle, that repeating cycle of sin, crying out, teshuvah, shofet, focusing on that. And I want to point out the concept of assimilation, which within that cycle and how it relates to us, and especially with the holiday of Hanukkah coming, I think it'll have a very nice lesson for us. And number three is I want to focus on the role of the judge. What is the job of the shofet at the end of the chapter to do in each and every single scenario? Those are the three major points that I want to tackle in this class as we go through chapter 2. We'll also touch on some commentaries and some side points. Should be interesting as we delve into it. So let's read the Pesukim together. If you have your Navi in front of you, or if you're on the Zoom following, it's projected on the screen. We're going to go through the first few Pesukim. The first episode is a scenario where a malach, which is a messenger or angel of Hashem perhaps, is coming to the Jewish people and with a very staunch warning. And let's see what he has to say. Pasuk says, Vaya'al malach Adonai min ha-Gilgal el ha-bochim. A malach Hashem, literally an angel of God or a messenger of God, came up from Gilgal to a place called Bochim. Bochim means crying, and we'll actually see why the place was called Bochim in this episode. Vayomer, and the malach said to the Jewish people, A'ale etchem miMitzrayim, I brought you up from Egypt. Va'avi etchem el haaretz, and I brought you to the land asher nishbati la'avotechem, that I swore to your forefathers. I've fulfilled my end of the bargain. Va'omar, and I said to you, Lo afer beriti ittechem le'olam, I will never nullify or negate my covenant with you for all eternity. Hashem says very unequivocally that he will not break his relationship with the Jewish people no matter what. Now that's supposed to be a vote of confidence for the Jewish people to help them continue their relationship. When someone says, you have spouses in a marriage and one spouse says, I'll never leave you forever, it doesn't say to the other spouse, well, guess what? They're not going to leave me forever, so I'm going to go commit adultery because my spouse is not going to leave me forever, right? That's not usually what goes through someone's mind. It's, oh, my spouse cares so much, they'll never leave me forever. I wouldn't dare do anything treacherous to betray that relationship that I have. But that's not the way the Jewish people deal with it, right? Instead, as a result, they don't listen to Hashem's word, which is the maddening thing about this whole situation. Pasuk Bet. Verse 2, Ve'atem lo tichretu berit liyoshevei haaretz hazot. Do not cut any treaties or covenants to the people of this land. Mizbehotehem titotzun. I instructed you to destroy their altars. Ve'lo shema'atem bekoli. You didn't listen to my word. You didn't heed my warnings. Mazot asitem. What have you done? Ve'gam amarti. I even foretold you this, says the malach in the name of God. Lo agaresh otam mipenechem. I'm not going to completely kick them out of you in one moment. That's going to be on your responsibility. God says, I took care of the major Canaanite powers. I basically debilitated them. All you had to do was do the last bit on your own. That's all I gave you to do. Everything else I handled, right? To give a sports analogy, it's like a team that drove all the way down the field to the 1 yard line. All you have to do is just put it in the end zone. All you got to do is go the extra mile. That I'm not going to do for you. I'm not going to take everything for you. That you got to do yourself. But you fell short. You didn't do it. They're going to be thorns for you. And their gods are going to be a trap for you. When the Jewish people heard these words from the angel of God, El Kol Bnei Israel, being said to the entire Jewish people, the people lifted their voices and they cried. Hence the name of the place is Bochim, the place of crying. This would forever be remembered as the place that the Jewish people cried at the testimony of the Malach Hashem, saying that the Jewish people failed God. They named the place where the Malach gave them this premonition, Bochim, and they gave sacrifices there to God. So it sounds like maybe we're coming around. Maybe we're coming full circle. The Malach is giving us this premonition, telling us we did wrong. We're crying over all of this. It sounds like, we've been moved and motivated to fix that which we have not done correctly. That's what it sounds like. Moving from there, the text tells us it recounts the end of Yeshua's life. And this is basically a repeat of the last chapter of the book of Yeshua. And so from there, Yeshua sends the Jewish people back to their land, each one to their inheritance, to go conquer the land. Wow, the Jewish people are serving God all the days of Yeshua, and all the days of the elders, which were lengthy in days after Yeshua. So there's a lot of promise at the end of Yeshua's life. It does sound a little bit here, Liz, to answer your question, it sounds a little bit here like there was some good years, some positive years after Yeshua left, and things were looking good, right? They had the elders that were like the remnants of the previous generation were still leading the people overwhelmingly in the path of Yeshua. So maybe from there, it sounded like, we don't need a leader because Yeshua set us up with these elders, and the elders are taking us very nicely. The problem is the elders are all part of the same ilk. They're all from that first generation that came into the land of Israel. They all saw the great hand and actions of God, Asher Asali Israel, who did for the Jewish people. And then what inevitably happens is when that generation dies out, the fire is lost. Vayamot Yehoshua ben Nun Eved Adonai. Yehoshua ben Nun, the servant of God, dies. Ben Me'ava Eser Shanim at the age of 110. They bury him in his own plot of land that they gave him in the mountain of Ephraim. Verse 10, that entire generation dies out. A new generation after them comes about, who did not know God, and all of the great things that they did. So what the Jewish people did not do well, what they failed to do is to encapsulate those memories, to bottle up all of the great things that Hashem did and pass them on to the next generation for them to feel a part of what the first generation experienced. And they failed to do that. I think there's a powerful lesson in this, right? For those of us who question why we do Pesach over and over again, for those of us who question what's the purpose of these holidays, Hajj, every year, over and over again, doing the same rituals and the same mitzvot and the same cleaning and the same this and the same that, I think this is a very powerful idea. Unlike the Egypt story, which Yetziat Mitzrayim, by the Torah's own commandments, was encapsulated and forcibly given to the Jewish people that they have to remember it and they have to live it each and every year, the conquest of the land of Israel was not. And I don't have an answer as to why it was not. I don't know why a special holiday was not created for the conquest of the land of Israel and its battles. I'm not sure why. But for whatever reason, maybe the miracles were too spread out. Maybe they weren't grand enough. Maybe they were too naturalistic. For whatever the reason is, we didn't have a holiday that sort of captured all of those battles. It was preserved in the book of Yeshua, but that wasn't enough for the people. The fact that they weren't reliving it year in and year out, by the time that generation died out and the next generation came in, it was as if nothing had ever happened. They just took for granted the fact that we live in Israel. This is our land. We farm it, we settle it, we live here, and there's really no difference here or anywhere else. And they took that element for granted, and that's what sort of leads to this deterioration of religious and moral observance on the part of the Jewish people. Of course, without anything to concrete to hold onto it by, you're going to lose it eventually. Yeah. I've seen them, yeah. Right. Right, exactly. Yeah, it's fun. Yeah, 100%. 100%. We have people in the shul. We have one of the members of our shul is one of the more recent immigrants from Syria, like that immigrated in the 90s and in that later part. And like when election day came, he's like, everyone has to vote. And we're like, whatever, election. He's like, but when you come from a country that wasn't free and you come to America, like you don't take those things for granted. And we, the second generation, the third generation, that's it, that we're 100%. It's only human nature that's going to happen. The problem is when you don't do that, and that leads you to a religious, forgetfulness is a problem. That's really the issue that we're going ahead and dealing with over here. So I think it's clear to us what the issue is over here. I don't know that it's not so much in the beginning a lack of leadership. In the beginning, it's really more the natural forgetfulness, and there isn't anything or anybody who can rally the troops around that, and hence what the problem is. So even with all of that very moving, touching ceremony of the Malach at Bochim, which kind of motivated the Jewish people, we don't exactly know when that took place, but it essentially encapsulates everything about the book of Shofetim. The Jews feel bad, they cry, but as soon as it's over, they move on and they just go back to the way life once is. There's just moments of inspiration, moments of spirituality, and they're fleeting and they go away, and the Jewish people are left to lick their wounds afterwards in moral deterioration. So there's no question that's what the book of Shofetim is definitely about. What did I want to bring, I think, from here? So something that I think is just interesting in the opening verses here is a point of comparison. It's clear that the text is trying to link the book of Joshua, the book of Yeshua, and the book of Shofetim together, not just by repeating all of these things that happened with Yeshua, but showing you their transition. But even take a good look at the beginning, at the opening of the chapter. The opening of the chapter describes this angel, right, who's coming to give them the ceremony. And look at the very first pasuk. It says, Vaya'al malach Hashem min ha-Gilgal. The malach came from the place of Gilgal to Bochim. What do we know about Gilgal? Anybody remember? Gilgal is the first place that the Jewish people landed after they crossed the Jordan River. That was their home, that was their hub, their center, their base, as it were, during the conquest of the land of Israel. Before they set up the Mishkan in Shiloh, which happens around where you are, Liz, in chapter 15 or so of Yeshua, that's where they set up the Mishkan. That's really more once they're ready to divide the land and settle the land. But during the conquest, the Jewish people are based out of Gilgal. That's where they did the first Brit Milah, when they circumcised, mass circumcision of the Jewish people. They did their first Korban Pesach. Gilgal represents an identity point of the Jewish people when they first got into the land of Israel. So it's so ironic that where is the angel coming from to criticize the Jewish people? He's coming from Gilgal, from the place which once stood for the Jewish people as their major place of identification, their hub of spirituality and holiness from where they conquered the entire land. And he's coming away from there to Bochim, to a place where the Jewish people are crying over their sins. In other words, just that little hint shows us where Bnei Israel have reached in their point, how far they've drifted away from the place of Gilgal, which was the hub of holiness and their major identity, to a place where they're crying over the fact that they can't conquer the Canaanite nations and they're not following the word of Hashem. That's showing you the deterioration in a nutshell. Another interesting point that I think the rabbis hit on in conjunction with this is we notice this Malach Hashem, this angel of God, a messenger of God, is not identified. Who is it? Could be an angelic figure. More likely, it's some kind of human figure, but we don't know who it is. His identity is covered up. What's interesting about that is, think all the way back into your memory banks in the book of Yeshua. Yeshua, chapter 5, right before he's about to go to Jericho, the first conquest of the Jewish people. What happens to Yeshua? Who does he meet up with? He meets up with an angel. An angel comes to him, and there's a sword in his hand, ready to depict conquest. And Yeshua asks him, are you with us or against us? And the angel says, Ata bati, I came now, we're going to go conquer, right? The image of the angel with his sword drawn in front of Yeshua is an image of God is with us. He's ready to conquer. He's ready to help us. God is going to divinely assist us in this great mission of conquering the land of Israel. The next time we see an angel appear to anybody is here, is this time. The angel is appearing with almost the opposite message. A message of, where have we gone? What's going on over here? What was started out as a promising conquest and a divine mission has all of a sudden hit a standstill and hit a roadblock. Where have we come to? And I think the rabbis encapsulate this message, the deterioration of the Jewish people through the angel, in such a beautiful way. If you look at the source sheet, the rabbis in Vayikra Rabbah, they identify who this messenger is, this angel of God. Who is the messenger? So interesting, huh? Very good. Rashi, quoting Vayikra Rabbah, quotes it as being Pinchas. I want to show you where he quotes it in Vayikra Rabbah. It's the first midrash of the book of Vayikra. He says the following. I'll skip down to the middle of it. He says, Mikan shehanevi'im nikra'im mal'achim. Prophets are also called mal'achim, messengers or angels. How do we know? Dichvate, in a similar case, our opening verse of chapter 2. Vaya'al mal'ach Hashem min ha'gilgal el ha'bochim. An angel of God came from Gilgal to Bochim. The Mishnah, the Midrash asks, V'chi mal'ach haya? Was it an angel? V'halo Pinchas haya. It was Pinchas. V'lama kore oto mal'ach. Why is it calling him an angel? To teach us, B'sha'a shehaya ruach hakodesh shora alav, when the divine inspiration would rest upon Pinchas or on any Navi, hayu panav bo'arot kelapidim. Their face would burn bright like a torch with the light of Hashem. Leaving the light of Hashem conversation aside, the rabbis identify this angel, this mysterious figure, as Pinchas. So take a step back for a moment and just let's talk about methodology. And I think we've mentioned this in many of our classes, but it's always very important. Anytime there's an unidentified person or figure in Tanakh, and the rabbis come and identify him very often as a person who we already know, somebody who is an already aforementioned figure, such as Pinchas, who's in the Torah, who's mentioned in a few different places. The rabbis are trying to teach us something. What are you going to say, Liz? Well, for sure, from a literal perspective, it would have to be Pinchas is hundreds of years old already, right? Because we're talking about somebody who was already in the times of the desert, so spent 40 years in the desert, then experienced the 14-year conquest in the land of Israel, outlived Yehoshua to the age of 110, and is now still around for what's going on over here. So he's quite old, right? Now, whether it's literal, maybe Hashem blessed him with arichut yamim and he lived a very long life, who knows? That's not the rabbi's point over here. That's always the thing. We sometimes can lose the forest for the trees. We get caught up in how old was he and we try to figure out the fantastic calculation. That's not what the rabbis are trying to teach us. By placing an identified character such as Pinchas, and linking him to an unidentified character here, the rabbis are teaching us a very, very important lesson. They're trying to express an idea to us. And what is that idea? Well, maybe we can connect it to another time when the rabbis identified Pinchas as somebody who was unidentified. Anybody know when that else was? So that he's identified. That's right. So Pinchas is known as the zealot who killed Zimri and Cozbi in the Midbar. That's the first time we see Pinchas. That's when he comes on the scene, and that's what he's known for. By the way, we also saw him in Yehoshua as the leading negotiator in the end of the book between the tribes of Reuven and Gad, who were on the other side of the Jordan River when they built that altar and they weren't sure if they were trying to rebel against the Jews. They sent Pinchas to go and have the conversation. So we see Pinchas as a peacemaker. There's another time in the Midrash that we see the rabbis use Pinchas to identify an unidentified person. Who is it? In chapter 2 of the book of Yehoshua, when Yehoshua sends 2 spies to go look at the city of Jericho. And those spies are unidentified. We don't know their names. Who do the rabbis say it is? It's Pinchas and Caleb, right? One of them they say is Pinchas. It's not Yehoshua because Yehoshua sent them. It's Pinchas, right? So interesting. Pinchas is mentioned as a spy in the beginning of Yehoshua, right around the Jericho time when you have that angel who's ready to conquer the peace for the Jewish people. And now all of a sudden we have Pinchas again as the one who's criticizing the Jewish people for their lack of conquest of the city, right, of the different Canaanite areas. And so again, even within Pinchas itself, look how Pinchas has to deliver such different messages. What's the message he delivers back from his spy, from his reconnaissance mission? What's the message he delivers back to Yehoshua? The people are scared of us. We're going to win the war. Everybody's going to melt in front of us. The mission the message that Pinchas brings back to Yehoshua as the spy all those years ago when they were ready to conquer the land is, this is ours for the taking. Now Pinchas, according to the Midrash, has to deliver a 180, a completely opposite message of God is not going to be with you if you don't do what he says. You got to attack and kill everybody. You got to take control. All of a sudden, it's a completely different mindset. It's a completely different emotion. I think the rabbis use Pinchas to show that dichotomy, to show again how much we've moved, how much we've deteriorated and spiraled downwards from what we had such a promising mission at the start of Yehoshua to where we are now at the start of the book of Shofetim. That the Gilgal mention, as well as the Midrash with Pinchas, shows us how far the Jewish people have fallen. And it's an ominous start to the book. Yeah. Right. It also fits beautifully his personality in that being a zealot for Hashem, saying, "Let's go. We got to, where's your inner Pinchas to go and take over these people, right? And it's time to make a move." And so Pinchas is really the perfect person to go ahead and to do this. So I guess to wrap that point up, we'll often see as we go through the book of Shoftim so many comparisons naturally to the book of Yehoshua, because chronologically and thematically they're sort of linked. But often those similarities will highlight intense differences between the two books and to show us how we've moved from what was a glory period and a golden age to a less than happy period and in a time of struggle and frustration for the Jewish people. I want to skip down a little bit. Excuse me. No, I'm actually in the wrong spot. No, we're going to start right where we picked up, right where we left off, I should say. Let's go back to where did we leave off? Verse 11, right? Pasuk Yud Aleph. Okay. Pasuk Yud Aleph now is really what the Malbim calls a ma'amar musgar. It's almost a bracketed statement. The text of the Navi here is going to cut out this next chunk to give us the cycle of sin. Let's read it together. The Jewish people would do evil in the eyes of God, and they would serve the Be'alim. I'm purposely for the moment not translating the word Be'alim. We're going to come back to try and explain what that means. They left the Lord their God, the God of their forefathers, who took them out of Egypt, and they went in the direction of other gods, from the gods of the other nations that surrounded them in their environment. They bowed to them, and they angered God with this behavior. They left and abandoned God, and they served the Baal and Ashtaroth instead. Again, I'm not explaining those two terms just for the moment. We'll come back to it. One question, though, that I want to raise right now is, you see a lot of redundancy here in the pasuk. It says multiple times, vaya'azvu, that they abandoned. Once it says at the beginning of verse 12, vaya'avdu et Adonai Elohei avotam. Then in verse 13, it says, vaya'avdu et Adonai. Again, why do we need this repetition of abandoning God? We'll see when we read the Malbim that there's actually steps into how they abandoned God, and we'll come back to that as well. Verse 14, I just want to get the Pesukim under our belt here. Vayiharaf Adonai b'Yisrael. After stage one of abandoning God with idolatry, the next step would be God would get angry at the Jewish people, vayitenem biyad shosim, and he would put them in the hands of marauders or evil people, vayashosu otam, and they would oppress them. Vayimkerem biyad oivehem misaviv, God would sell them and give them into the hands of their enemies around. Velo yachlu od, they could not take it anymore. La'amod lifnei oivehem, to stand in front of their enemies. One thing that's interesting about the book of Shoftim is the enemies that typically come to attack the Jewish people are never these large empires. They're often very small neighboring countries that attack them, and often don't attack the Jewish people as a whole. They'll usually only attack or oppress one tribe that's maybe very near to them or that they can get their hands on. They don't often go for the entire Jewish people, except in a few cases. But they often will just go and attack one tribe, and that tribe will have to find a way out of their problems, and often without the help of the rest of the Jewish people, which is unfortunate, but not surprising. In verse 15, in everything that they came out, the hand of God was at them for evil, for bad. Just like God said. And just as God swore to them. There was a lot of pain and suffering for the Jewish people, but nothing that they were not already privy to. In other words, the Jewish people knew what was coming. This is not a surprise to them. So that's step number 2, I guess, right? So step number 2 was being sold in the hands of an enemy. And really in there, sort of in step, you kind of hear step number 3, where the Jewish people couldn't take it anymore and they were in pain. They would call out to God and ask for forgiveness. Step 4, verse 16, Vayakim Adonai Shofetim. God would bring up for them judges. Vayoshium miyad shosehem, and they would save them from their oppressors. Vegam el shoftehem lo shabehu. But then even after they were relieved of the enemies from their oppressors, they would ignore the shoftim themselves. Kizanu ahare Elohim aharim, because their heart would stray after idolatry, after other gods. And they would again bow to them. Right? They strayed quickly from the path which their forefathers had walked down. To listen to the commandments of God, they did not do. Once God brought them up a shofet, they would listen to the shofet all his days. He would save them. And God would give them respite from their cries, from those who were pressing and pushing them. In verse 19, once the shofet would die, they would go back and they would again be corrupt from their forefathers, to go after their idolatry, to serve them, to bow to them. They would not move off of this because of their bad ways or because of their issues. And then God again would get angry at them. You're hearing the cycle repeat. And he would say, because this nation did not listen to my words and they did not pay attention to me, I will not let them conquer any more of their land. God would not help them to conquer them. All of this to test the Jewish people, who were keeping the would they in fact keep the ways of Hashem to walk with them, like their forefathers had did, or not? God left the Goyim around to not allow them to be conquered and did not give them into the hands of Yehoshua and the Jewish people. So we see the cycle that will repeat itself over and over again, leaving Hashem with Avodah Zarah, being sold into the hands of an enemy that they left around in this area, having to call out to Hashem. Hashem sends them a shofet, gives them temporary relief. The Jewish people are good during that time period. Eventually, the shofet dies. The Jewish people again go back. God says, I'm not interested in being with you if you're going to worship idolatry. I'm done with this. God says, I'm not going to let them conquer the people around you. I'm going to make this a test for you. It's going to be how long you can overcome it. How much are you willing to commit and to devote yourself to Hashem, to get rid of these people, to follow the laws? Then I'll help you. You're not willing to do that? I'll see you later. And the cycle continues to repeat itself over and over again. And anytime you're getting stuck in this loop, in this cycle, it's nothing but frustration and madness for the readers who are going through this time and again. Why can't they get the message? If we're getting it and it's there, and it's not as if they weren't told about it, God's saying, I told you this over and over again. He sent the malach to them. They know exactly what's going to happen, and they just cannot avoid the problems. It's just too overwhelming and too tempting for them. They cannot seem to overcome the temptation. And it's very frustrating. There's no question. And that brings us to point number 2, unless there's questions or comments on the point number 2 is, what is it? This is the question I mentioned at the beginning. What is it about Avodah Zarah that's so tempting that the Jewish people cannot bring themselves to separate from this? What is it? How is it that they keep falling prey to this trap time and again? Any thoughts? What is so enticing about Avodah Zarah? So wanting to fit in is always a very big motivation, right? And no question. The problem is that the Jews are the majority here, right? We're the ones in control. We're taxing them. We've conquered the powers. Our hand is above and more powerful than these little Canaanite enclaves and factions that remain in the land, right? So we're not able to push them out and conquer them and completely, drive them away. But certainly the land is in the hands of the Jewish people. We are the superpower in that area. Why we try to fit into them? The assimilation factor is strange. Why that would be the case? I agree with you that it is I agree with you. The question is why. It's one thing when we're the minority and the other people are the majority. We want to fit in. But when we're the majority and we're the powerful, we still want to fit in. It doesn't make any sense, right? Huh? Okay. So there's no question. Idolatry offers a number of very tempting aspects about it, right? One very tempting aspect about it, I often don't think about this, Rabbi Hatton beautifully encapsulates this, and I never really realized this until he mentions it. He says the following. We won't explain yet what Baal and Ashtoret are, but those are the common gods of that time. He says idolatry tolerates other gods. You can be an idolater and follow the Canaanite ways and still pretend like you believe in God. In other words, the Canaanite nations didn't have a problem accepting the Jews who also believed in their God, but believed also in their other gods. In other words, idolatry has a place for everybody, right? If you believe in this and I don't believe in it, I'm okay with that as long as you also believe in what I believe in. If we all believe in each other's, right? Or even if I don't believe in yours, but you believe in mine, okay, I can accept you because you also believe in mine, but you can believe in yours too. There's not an exclusivity. You don't have to believe in one thing, and if you don't believe in this, you're out, right? It doesn't work like that in idolatry. Idolatry is easy to be inclusive. Judaism is very hard. Judaism says you have to worship this God and none other. Anything else but this, you're out. It's very exclusive. And so Judaism doesn't tolerate anybody else, but everybody else tolerates Judaism. Why do I say that that's so important? Because Jews were able to worship God at the same time that they were doing idolatry. They were able to actually partner the two together. And so they felt like they from themselves, like they weren't completely abandoning God and Judaism. They still believed in Judaism. They kept Hanukkah and they kept Christmas. They did both, right? So you still feel like I'm Jewish, right? Think about Americans today. It's no different, right? A Jewish man marries a non-Jewish woman. We're multicultural. We have Jewish holidays and we have the Christian holidays and we have these holidays and we have those holidays. and we'll celebrate everybody's holidays. We're all good with that, but I'm still Jewish, right? And so you can tolerate and include everything into it and still feel like I'm Jewish, still keeping my nature, while you're still doing all those other things. That's what you think works. Because idolatry teaches you, if you're really practicing idolatry, that you can include everything. And Judaism says, you got to choose. You either are in or you're out. You have to choose one God, and you can only do one type of celebration. You can only do one thing. Everything else is exclusive to that. And so Judaism is very restricting. The Jews didn't think of it like that. They were really worshiping idolatry, but it wasn't just idolatry. They were still kind of playing both sides. And so that, I think, is how they initially started to get sucked in to the idolatry. Is idolatry didn't ask them to completely abandon everything about Judaism in the first minute that they got into it. They said, no, you can still keep your Judaism, but also do these things. Okay, not such a big deal, right? Then eventually, as they continued to do more and more, they deteriorated further and further to the point where they abandoned their Judaism. This is how the Malbim, remember I pointed out how the Malbim how we noted in the text of the Navi, it says Vaya'azvu twice. This is how the Malbim explains it. If you look in the source sheet here, the Malbim says it's actually a 3-step process to finally reaching rock bottom when it comes to idolatry. I'll read to you we'll read it in the English for a minute. I can't get the thing up. He says, from verse 11 to 20 is a separate statement which introduces and summarizes the entire book of Shofetim. The text focuses on 3 stages of sin. First, they did evil in the eyes of God to sin against the mitzvot. First thing is, they kind of weakened their performance of mitzvot. That's always the first step. Once you stop becoming so observant, I don't have to keep this, I don't have to keep that, you start to move away. Right? Number 2, they then reached the point of worshiping the Baalim. They started to now engage in idolatry. Within this deterioration of idolatry, there were also 2 stages. For there is worshiping idols in conjunction with God, and then there is exclusive idolatrous practice. First, they practiced jointly, which is the meaning of they abandoned God, the Lord of their fathers. It starts by saying they abandoned God, the Lord of their fathers. What does it mean they abandoned God, the Lord of their fathers? There is a difference when the text mentions God plainly, which indicates his status as creator, to when the name of Elohim is mentioned as in the Lord of their fathers. For then it describes the national connection with their forefathers. In other words, when it says they abandoned their forefathers, what does that mean? They left their traditions. They left their mitzvot behind, and they also left God from the standpoint of being exclusive. They didn't leave God completely. They left him from being exclusive. And they said, from this perspective, it is forbidden to practice idolatry even in conjunction with God. For they are not under the dominion of any officer or celestial body, but only God, as it states that God gave out the idolatry to the other nations, but you, God, took. In other words, God tells us, I'm your only guy. You can't have anybody else. That's what Hashem made with the forefathers. He made a deal. It's just me. To bring anybody else in and in conjunction with God, worship them, is to betray the promise of the forefathers. That's what it means when it says, "Vayazvu et Hashem Elohei avotam." They abandoned God of their forefathers. In other words, the exclusivity, the monogamy of Judaism went away. And they brought in other things to invade the relationship. The next step after that, he says, is Vayazvu et Hashem. They just abandoned God outright. After having this lack of monogamy with God, a lack of exclusivity, eventually they just said, I'm out from God altogether. And they just abandoned God as creator or as anything. So it's a 3-step process, says the Malbim. First, you stop doing mitzvot. You stop keeping your traditions. You stop doing the practices that make you unique. Second, you invade with something else. You still keep your identity, but you mix it up with another identity. And once that is enough embedded, you then abandon the whole thing. And you just focus in on idolatry. Yeah, huh? Exactly. 100%. It was weak. The Jews the Mishkan is in one point. And the Jews are in their own territories, focused on themselves, trying to build their communities, trying to build their agriculture and their economy. They're in very political mode. I'm sure there were, but overwhelmingly as a whole, it's not a period of high moral awareness, high religious awareness. And each tribe in and of themselves starts to deteriorate in their own fashion, in their own way. I like what Liz said before about the reform, that this is what happens, right? You start to first say, maybe we don't have to be so adamant about every mitzvah. We could be a little loose, loosen the reins here, loosen the reins there. Don't worry about this halakha, don't worry about that mitzvah. This one doesn't make sense so much to us. We'll keep our Jewish identity exclusively, but we're just going to loosen the structure. Once the structure gets loosened, there's room for infiltration of other things to get in. You start to balance the two. It's okay as long as we have our Jewish religion, but we can also try to be multicultural. And then eventually anything that you bring into Judaism, it inevitably overrides it. Inevitably, Judaism will not stand together with anything else because it's by nature has to be exclusive. And eventually you realize what the heck's the point of this? I'm out. And you're just going with the other way. And that's the second point about what makes Avodah Zarah so enticing, is that Avodah Zarah is enjoyable. What do I mean by that? So Rabbi Hatton points out that archaeology today and everything else teaches us that how did they worship Avodah Zarah? They worshipped Avodah Zarah with drinking, with promiscuity, with prostitution, with temples of debauchery and all these other lewd kinds of practices, which are very enticing to people, right? It's naturally tempting for people to want to be involved in that, right? And so when you couple the fact that the people are telling you it's okay to still be Jewish as long as you also do this, and maybe some of the practices are similar, and then they also become very inviting, and then they also become very tempting, eventually you're going to come very close to just eventually doing Avodah Zarah time and again. By the way, another point that Rabbi Hatton makes is it was also very easy for the Jewish people to keep their Avodah Zarah while still repenting. What do I mean by that? Think about how the cycle works. The cycle is, oh God, bad things that start happening. Oh God, please forgive us. Oh God, please forgive us. Okay, God forgives you. And then you just go right back to it again. How do you just go back to it again like that? It's because it's so easy, given the fact that you can try to convince yourself of worshiping God and Avodah Zarah at the same time. So all they needed to do was to do a very childish thing, right? You had your God and you had your idols, right? So when things were going bad, you kissed the idols and you left God. God, things are going good, bring the idols back, right? It's just very easy. You just leave God there, and it's just a matter of fluctuating between your idols or not, right? You can play around with this in so many different ways. And so because it was enticing, because it was easy, because you tried to convince yourself and rationalize it away, that's how it made for an easy cycle to constantly repeat itself over and over again, and for the Jews to get themselves caught in it time and again. And that's where I think that's a very important lesson for us. I think a few things that we take away. One, you don't stray off the path overnight. It takes time. There's usually stages about it. And it usually starts with a lack of observance of the mitzvot. Anybody who ever thinks to themselves, I could still be Jewish, I could still keep my identity, but I don't have to necessarily practice all of these things, is convincing themselves of idolatry. They're starting the process of Avodah Zarah because eventually they will abandon it all. Number two, you can't be wishy-washy in Judaism. You can't try to keep both sides of the coin. You can't try to bring in outside influences and outside practices and try to make them work in Judaism. Judaism is like a marriage. Just like I can't bring in another woman into my marriage in any way, shape, or form, in any way. Can't have a friend who's a female. You can't do anything like that. You have to be exclusive. You have to be monogamous to the extreme. Anything else that you bring in is going to deteriorate the relationship. That's the way Judaism works. And no other religion, at least in the idolatry, in the polytheistic world, works like that. In polytheism, bring in as many people as you want, the more the merrier. It doesn't work like that when it comes to Judaism. And also the idea that Judaism is not always easy. It's not going to be the most enticing. It's not going to be the most physically pleasurable. It's not going to be the thing that we love to do all the time. And a lot of other religions are going to look a lot nicer, a lot more appealing on the surface, a lot more enticing. We have to stay away from that. We have to make sure to push those things away and to not get ourselves involved in them in as much as possible. I think those are a few very, very powerful lessons that we can learn from this cycle, and to help us understand that while we're reading this passage and saying, oh, how could they do that? I think we are guilty of that sometimes as well. I honestly do believe that we are guilty, maybe not to idolatry, but to many other things, where we convince ourselves and rationalize that doing something is okay. Things don't go right for us. We call out to Hashem. And then when things start going good, we go back to the way we once were. We start to get ourselves lax again. Might not be idolatry in the sense that it was back then, but we have our own idolatry in today's day and age in many different forms. So we have to stay away from judging the characters here and say quite the opposite. I think this is something that we find ourselves in as well very often, and something we have to learn from this book, how to stay away from it. I think that's those are all very, very important lessons and very, very important takeaways from this chapter. I like to close with one idea, and then maybe also talk about what the Baalim are. One other idea that I think stands out for me is when you think about the cycle that is going on in Sefer Shoftim. The Jewish people see what's around them, and they start to get enticed by the Avodah Zarah. And the irony of all ironies happens. They do Avodah Zarah, and they try to fit in with the rest of the people around them, and what happens? They get attacked by them. This doesn't really make much sense, right? You'd think that the more we try to be like the other goyim and fit in with them, the more they'd say, hey, these guys are good, let's all partner up. They're not going to come and attack us. It's counterintuitive. What's the message? What is God telling us? You can try all you want to assimilate as a Jew. The more you try to assimilate, the more the goyim will push you out. You think that by being more like them, you'll fit in with them and they'll leave you alone. It's the opposite. The more Jews try to fit in with the goyim, either because Hashem doesn't allow it, which is one explanation why. Hashem is the one who's sending the goyim to fight us inexplicably, but it's Hashem who's the one who's sending them to do it. So Hashem says, I'm not going to let you to assimilate in with them. The moment you start assimilating, I'm sending them to come and attack you so that you can get out of this funk. God doesn't let us assimilate. The non-Jews don't want us to assimilate. The more we start to assimilate, the more suspicious they get of us, right? Wait a minute, these Jews, they're trying to get into the government, they're trying to get into here, they're trying to do this, they're trying to do that. No, you're a Jew, identified, gold star, here you go, you're a Jew, right? The more you try to be like them, the more they push back on you and say, no, you can't be like us. And that's either because they get suspicious of us, or more likely what the text is telling us is God doesn't allow it to happen. So if we ever think to ourselves, oh, we will just be like the goyim and everything will be good for us, think again. Book of Shoftim tells us it's not meant to be, and it cannot happen. The Jewish people cannot and will not assimilate with the goyim. God won't see to it that it will happen. There will be casualties along the way if we do. It's not to say that we as individuals can't. There'll be casualties. But as a whole, the Jewish people, it'll never happen. God won't let it happen. But we'll have to suffer the consequences. So we have a choice. We can maintain our identity, be proud of it, and live by it, or we could try to assimilate and suffer the consequences of that and have Hashem force us to have to be Jewish. We could do this, as they say, the easy way or the hard way. Oftentimes we choose the hard way, and we should be trying to choose the easy way more, is what the text of the Navi over here is trying to say us. Had we just kept to who we were, God would have protected us and helped us and would have drove the Canaanim out. Because we couldn't, God had to choose the hard way by bringing enemies to help us to be saved. And so I think coming up to Chanukah, a holiday of assimilation, another very powerful message that we could take away is to try to stay true to who we are and identity and our Torah, because that's what's meant to be and that's what God's going to make us do in the end of the day anyway. To wrap up our study of chapter 2, I'll just mention very briefly, we didn't explain what Baalim and Ashtarot are. I know I'm doing a lot, but the Baalim and Ashtarot were the two major forms of Canaanite gods. The Baal in Hebrew means to be a master. The worshippers looked at them as their master. And there were different kinds of Baal. There was Baal this and Baal that. Any god that they basically worshiped was referred to as a Baal, right? And that's what Baalim means. It's more of a general term. Archaeology has uncovered that for us as well. The rabbis of the commentaries of the Tanakh struggle to figure out what these Baal and Ashtoreth are. They're very foreign ideas to them because the rabbis who are making commentaries didn't have them in their time. And they also didn't have the archaeology to discover what it might have been. Today, modern day archaeology tells us what types of Baal they had and what types of practices they used to do and what it is that they were worshiping. I'll even read to you from, if you allow me for just a moment. He brings over here, he says, thanks to archaeological discoveries, we now know that Baal was in fact the most important member of the Canaanite pantheon. He was avidly worshipped throughout the land as the god of storms, winds, and rainfall. So a lot having to do with weather and nature. His weapon of choice was the thunderbolt, very similar to Zeus, a Greek god. Baal's consort was Ashtoret, that was his female version, who was often represented as a well-endowed female and revered as the goddess of fertility. Why is this important? Because if you think about what idolatry is everybody worships the god that is most necessary to them. So what did the people who lived in Canaan, the Canaanite nations, what did they need the most? They needed two things. They lived in Israel, which needs rain to survive, and they needed fertility to be able to procreate. Those were the two major things that they needed. So who did they worship? Baal and Ashtoret. Baal was the god of the rains and the winds and everything else, and Ashtoret was the god of fertility. You worship the god that meant the most to you. What did they worship in Egypt? The sun, the Nile. Those were the things that meant the most to them. The sun grew the crops, the Nile watered everything. Boom, that's what you worship. Idolatry is worshiping what's most important to me. That's why my idols are different than your idols, because depending on where you live and what you need is different than where I live and what I need. So I worship what I need, you worship what you need. Judaism is very different. God is the God of everything. We all worship the same God who's in control of everything. Doesn't matter what I need and what you need. It's not about that. It's not about me and you. It's about God. A whole different perspective into the way life works. And that's what idolatry did. But which of those sounds more enticing? A religion that's about me or a religion that's about God? For most people, I want the religion to be about me, right? That's what I want to worship me. Most people want to worship themselves. I want to worship what's going to be beneficial for me, not what's going to be beneficial to the world or beneficial to you. What do I care? I care about myself. And so understanding what these gods are helps us to understand why it is that they were worshiping it and what was so enticing even to the Jewish people about worshiping it. Because if a non-Jew came to a Jew and said, hey, worship this thing, I promise you, I worship this guy. Look at my field. It's doing great. Your field's not doing so well. Worship this guy. It'll help you. Oh, really? It's enticing. It's hard to stay away from. Okay, I'll do that while I do my God. Don't worry, I'll do my God also, but I'll do your God too. We'll do it together. Huh? It's exactly what it is. That's what it is. It's enticing. It's addicting, and that's sort of what they did. So I think all of that definitely helps us to understand. I'll close by saying the last thing was and I keep saying I'm going to close. What's the role of the shofet? The shofet's job is, even though shofet means a judge, he's not really a judge, right? A judge sounds like someone who's going to judge the cases. Almost none of the judges that we're going to encounter were real judges, maybe one or two. When we say judge, what we mean is someone who is a religious figure, someone who's going to repair the religious damage that's being done to the nation. But most importantly, it's someone who's going to lead the people in battle. And the war aspect of it is what's really going to make the judges have their flair. A lot of the discussion and a lot of the details in the stories are going to be about the war and the battles and how they fought to try and maintain their autonomy. And so that's why a lot of judges who might not be the most religious figures and the most top-notch people are considered some of the most powerful judges because they were very successful in victory and in war. So the judge really has a three-part. Sometimes to judge the people, that's more of a minimal responsibility. Many times to bring a religious repair, which is done by many judges, but not all. But most importantly, every judge has in common their military prowess and their military victory that they're going to bring. And that's what we're going to see in the coming chapters as we begin to explore the nitty-gritty stories and each and every judge and what we can learn from each of those stories. So to summarize, we talked about the general cycle of sin that's going to repeat itself over and over again throughout the book of Shofetim, why idolatry is so enticing, how idolatry is different than Judaism, exclusivity versus a pantheon of gods, yourself at the center versus God at the center. We talked a lot about Sefer Yehoshua and the deterioration of the Jewish people and where they reached. And we also talked about the role of the Shofet and what his job is that we're going to see come into fruition in the next, in all of the different chapters as we get deeper and deeper into the book. Any questions or comments from anybody before we adjourn and say goodbye? A lot. We got in an earful today. A lot of stuff. I would say the biggest thing to take away is the idolatry. That's the biggest thing, because that's really the key that's going to go throughout the book. It's why idolatry is so different than Judaism. That's really the crux of today's class, I would say. All the stuff added to it, but a lot to digest in there.